Thank you, Mr. Richard Cunningham, for sending us such a meaningful story through email. Tonight, Dust and Destiny brings it back to life for you, as a tale drawn from real fragments of the Old West, told in the words of those who remembered it. Before dawn on the Mogollon Rim, a noose already swung from the branch of a pale birch. Folks in Silver Creek were waiting for an Apache to walk into town so they could call it payment for the hard winter ahead. That was the way people spoke in the Arizona Territory during the late 1880s. Winter came early up on the high country. The winds blew like a whip across your skin. Snow buried the mountain passes, and even the strongest cattlemen counted each sack of flour like it was gold dust. In towns like Silver Creek, survival wasn't guaranteed by prayer or by law. It was guaranteed by who held the rifle steadiest, who stood tallest when things turned ugly. Silver Creek was little more than a stretch of Main Street, a saloon with floorboards that squeaked when you walked, a church steeple small enough to vanish under the snowdrifts, a post office that doubled as a general store, and a grain warehouse that kept the settlement alive when the storms cut off supply wagons. The town had a sheriff, but most folks would tell you law and order was just another name for who carried the Colt on their hip. Into this fragile balance stepped Chayton Naiche, a man the townsfolk already whispered about. He was Apache by blood, born in the mountains, raised between the traditions of his people and the long shadow of the U.S. Army. In his younger years, he had scouted for cavalry units during the campaigns, guiding them through canyons and passes, sometimes against his own kin. That past clung to him like smoke. No matter where he went, someone would call him traitor and someone else would call him savage. By the time he reached his 30s, he had put away the soldier's life and taken up work as a tracker and trapper, a man living half in the wilderness, half on the edge of towns that would never truly claim him. He was tall in the shoulders, with the kind of scars that told stories better left unspoken. One scar, long and jagged, stretched across his left shoulder from the blade of a Mexican vaquero in a fight years back. His eyes were quiet, steady, like a dark lake at midnight. Few dared meet that gaze for long, but Silver Creek was not a town that welcomed outsiders, and least of all, an Apache. Sheriff Walt Dugan, a weary veteran of the Civil War, believed he kept order with his badge. He was not cruel by nature, but he clung to the idea that white men's rules were the only way to keep peace. For Dugan, allowing Chayton to linger meant testing the patience of his voters. And then there was Elias Boone, a rancher whose herds were spreading across every empty valley. Boone had an eye on the thawing basin near Nora Hart's cabin, a place with water enough to keep cattle through the summer. Boone didn't care who froze, starved, or bled, so long as he got his claim. The spark that lit this powder keg came on a moonless night. Wolves had been circling the edges of Nora Hart's property. She was a widow not yet 30. Her husband killed 2 winters before when an avalanche caught his mule train in the pass. Alone since, Nora had fought to keep her small cabin upright, her pantry stocked, and her pride unbroken. She was stubborn, and that stubbornness nearly killed her when the wolves finally came. They slipped through the tree line as she chopped kindling, their eyes burning yellow in the dark. Her shotgun misfired with the first pull, leaving her cornered against the woodpile. That was when Chayton appeared, moving silent as a shadow, his long rifle barking once, twice, scattering the pack into the timber. He lifted the last wounded wolf by its scruff and ended it clean, quick as a strike of lightning. It should have ended there, with a nod of thanks and the quiet retreat of a man who owed her nothing. But in towns like Silver Creek, stories bent fast. By morning, whispers spread like wildfire. The Apache had been lurking around Nora's place. Some said he saved her, others claimed he had frightened her. By the second retelling, the truth was already buried under suspicion. To some, Chayton was no rescuer but a trespasser, a savage circling a white widow's cabin. Boone fed the rumors with a smile because a ruined reputation was as good as a deed in his line of business. Dugan tried to quiet the crowd, but his voice was weak against the growl of fear and prejudice. So the noose was strung on the birch outside town, swaying in the wind, waiting for the day Chayton Naiche dared to show his face again. And here is where the story truly begins, where honor, survival, and justice collide like storm fronts over the Mogollon. So I'll leave you with a question before we step deeper into this tale. In a town where prejudice weighed heavier than the law, should a man save a stranger and walk away? Or should he stand his ground, knowing that the price might be a bullet or the hangman's rope? Chaitan Naichi carried the kind of past that never let a man sleep long. His father had been a guide for soldiers and surveyors, an Apache who spoke Spanish and English as easily as his mother tongue. His mother was a weaver, known for patterns that carried the stories of her people in every stitch. Together, they raised him to know the mountains like family, the canyons, the deer trails, the stars. But as soon as Chaitan grew tall enough to carry a rifle, the world demanded more than he wanted to give. The army called him useful. He could track a fugitive in snowfall, read a broken branch like a map, smell smoke on the wind when others saw nothing. He rode with cavalry officers through Apache country, pointing out safe passes, marking streams where men and horses could drink. For this, some whites called him friend. For this, some of his own kin called him traitor. He had lived between those judgments ever since. To the army, he was never fully trusted, always one glance away from suspicion. To his own people, he was a man who had sold his honor to a foreign flag, so he left them all. He walked away from the contracts, the pay, the blood-soaked campaigns. By the time he was 30, he hunted alone, guided travelers for coin, trapped beaver in mountain streams. But the ghosts followed, faces of men he'd tracked and cornered for soldiers, the hollow eyes of women left behind when villages burned. At night, he dreamt of voices singing laments in a language he half remembered. And yet, for all that, he remained a man of quiet bearing, carrying the weight without complaint. Nora Hart knew something about weight as well. She was 28, though the past 2 winters had carved deeper lines into her face than any woman her age deserved. 2 years earlier, her husband Thomas had taken a mule train up Eagles Pass for timber. The storm that struck buried the whole caravan under a wall of snow. Weeks later, the search party found him frozen stiff, still clutching a length of rope in his frost-bitten hands. The mule had stumbled back half dead to her cabin. Thomas never did. Nora buried him in the churchyard herself because the ground was too frozen for the gravedigger's spade. Since then, she had fought to keep a roof over her head, mending shingles with her own hands, patching holes with rags, working soil too lean to give more than stringy carrots and bitter turnips. She sold off her husband's tools piece by piece until nothing was left but the house, a couple chickens, and a memory. She wore his wedding band tied inside her apron pocket. Some nights she pressed it into her palm until it left a mark, just to remind herself she was still alive. By October, the signs of another punishing season were everywhere. The creek that gave Silver Creek its name had begun to crust with ice at the edges. The first flurries dusted the roof lines. Wolves came closer, desperate, their howls rolling over the valley like sermons of hunger. Every family in town hoarded what they could: barrels of coal, sacks of flour, whiskey enough to trade when coin failed. The wealthy bought up supplies twice over. The poor made do with less, or nothing at all. Elias Boone had the most. His ranch stretched across the low valley, his cattle fat and loud, his barns crammed with hay. He wore his success like a badge, as if it excused the cruelty that followed him like a pack dog. When Nora's husband died, Boone had circled her land like a vulture. When she refused his offers, he smiled, tipped his hat, and waited. Now, with an Apache's shadow crossing her cabin, Boone saw his chance. The story started small, Boone's hired hands whispering that Nora had invited Chaitan into her home. By the second retelling at the saloon, it became that the widow had spent the night with him. By sunrise, Boone was standing in the street saying the town had a moral duty to keep savages away from decent women. Sheriff Walt Dugan listened with his jaw clenched. He knew Boone's mouth was a snake pit, but he also knew the crowd. The men drinking whiskey at 10 in the morning, the matrons pretending scandal while feeding on gossip. They were the jury that mattered. Dugan was tired. He'd fought under the Union banner at Antietam, seen good men cut to ribbons while officers shouted for order. Out here in Silver Creek, he kept the badge polished, but his heart had grown wary. He believed in order, not necessarily justice. Boone's influence stretched across half the town's pocketbooks. So Dugan hesitated. and hesitation is all it takes for cruelty to grow. By nightfall, someone had thrown a rope over the birch at the edge of Main Street. The knot was tied neat, swaying in the wind like a promise. It said what no one dared say aloud. When the Apache showed his face, he'd swing. Nora heard the rumors. She kept her head down, carried water, chopped wood, ignored the way neighbors glanced at her door. But inside her cabin, she shook with anger. Chayton had saved her life. Without him, the wolves would have torn her apart. And now his reward was a noose? For Chayton, the choice seemed familiar. He had walked away before, from contracts, from promises, from places where gratitude turned to suspicion overnight. He could pack up his rifle, vanish into the timber, and never look back. The winter would kill some of them anyway. He owed nothing to a town that saw him as less than human. But something held him still. Maybe it was the way Nora had looked at him that night. Not with fear, but with relief, as if she had glimpsed a lifeline in the storm. Maybe it was his own weariness of running. A man can only outrun himself so many miles before he circles back to the same question, stand or disappear. Justice and law were not the same in Silver Creek. The law said, Indians out. Justice whispered that the liar in this story was Boone, not him. Survival demanded distance. Honor demanded presence. That evening, as the sun sank behind the Mogollon Rim, Nora lit a single candle and set it in the window. It was a small gesture, one flicker against the dark, but it meant everything. To the town, it might look like nothing. To Chayton, watching from the tree line, it was a signal, a plea, a declaration that she would not be silent, even if it cost her reputation. He stood in the cold for a long time, cloak pulled tight, breath turning white in the air. He saw the noose in the distance, swaying over the street. He saw Boone's men at the saloon door, laughing too loudly. He saw Sheriff Dugan staring at his badge, as if wondering what it still meant. Chayton's hand rested on the scar at his shoulder, a reminder of battles past. His heart weighed the scales. Life alone in the hills, or life chained to this moment. Finally, he turned toward Nora's cabin. And now the question passes to you, listening by the glow of your own lamp. If you were Chayton Naichi, would you walk away to keep your neck safe, or would you stay, knowing that every step closer to that candle in the window was a step closer to the hangman's rope in Silver Creek? The first snow came like a thief in the night. By morning, Silver Creek lay wrapped in a thin white sheet, the rooftops sagging under wet flakes, the air brittle with cold. It was the kind of storm that promised more to come, storms that would cave in roofs and bury fence lines until spring thaw. For Nora, it meant the war for survival had already begun. Chayton rose before the sun, scanning the roofline of her cabin. Shingles were loose, rafters creaked under the weight of snow. He climbed the ladder without a word and began prying up boards, resetting them tighter against the wind. He showed Nora how to wedge straw and mud into the cracks where the cold knifed through. He dug trenches around the foundation so that meltwater would run clear instead of seeping into the earth floor. She worked beside him, her hands red from the cold, but steady. That night, the town came alive with another kind of storm. At the saloon, boots hammered against wooden floors, glasses clinked, and the same old whispers sharpened into accusations. The Apaches moved into the widow's place, a ranch hand muttered. Boone says he was invited. The lies spread like wildfire on dry sagebrush, catching in every ear that wanted an easy villain. Men drank them down with whiskey. By the time the lanterns dimmed, the story had grown claws. Some claimed they saw shadows moving behind Nora's curtain. Others said they'd heard her laugh in Apache tongue. Chayton ignored it. He had weathered storms of words before, but words in a town like Silver Creek had a way of becoming ropes and bullets. The second trial struck harder. One night, the grain storehouse at the edge of town went up in flames, orange sparks roaring against the black sky. Townsfolk scrambled with buckets of water, their shouts echoing through the streets. By dawn, the damage was done. Half the winter stores had gone to ash. All it took was one finger pointing. The Apache did it. The words fell from Boone's lips smooth as oil. He reminded them that the widow had been seen with him, that outsiders, always brought ruin. Some nodded, already convinced. Others stared at the noose swaying outside the saloon. But the ground told a different story. Chayton read the tracks in the ash, heavy boots with a broken heel, leading not toward the hills, but toward Boone's own ranch. He called for Dugan, who reluctantly followed him across the creek bed. There, plain as day, were the same tracks, circling back to Boone's corrals. Dugan saw it, no denying. His face was lined with shame. "I know what this means," he muttered. "But if I call it out, half the town will say I'm covering for you. Boone's got men and he's got money. You've got nothing." He tugged at his badge as though it burned his chest. "Best you ride out, Naichi, for your own sake." Chayton's eyes stayed calm, but his words were steel. "If I ride, the lie wins. Tomorrow it won't be me. Tomorrow it'll be some farmer too poor to fight back." Dugan had no answer. He turned away, the coward's choice heavy on his shoulders. The third trial was quieter, but crueler. Hunger. By mid-December, cupboards were bare. Nora's chickens stopped laying, and the last of her beans had gone sour in the frost. She pulled a cloth from a corner of her trunk and unfolded her husband's old pump organ, the one luxury he'd bought before the accident. She whispered to herself that she'd sell it, trade it for flour, anything to keep alive. Chayton stopped her. "Keep it," he said simply. Then he slung his rifle and disappeared into the snow. 2 days later, he returned dragging a mule deer, its antlers wide as a wagon wheel. He butchered it with careful hands, wrapped the meat in cloth, and took half to a widow at the end of town who had no family left to feed her. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Some townsfolk frowned, muttering about Apache charity, but others paused. They saw the meat, they saw the widow smile for the first time all winter, and doubt crept into their certainty. Maybe Boone's stories weren't the whole truth. Boone saw his grip slipping and tightened his fist. He sent for 3 gunmen from out of town, hired killers with cold eyes, men who measured worth in bullets. They arrived one evening, their spurs jangling as they stepped into the saloon, each carrying a Colt that looked well used. Boone let them drink on his tab and spoke loud enough for the room to hear. By the week's end, Silver Creek will be rid of its problem. The church bell rang the next morning, calling townsfolk to a meeting. Sheriff Dugan stood before them, hollow-eyed. He announced his plan to hold Chayton in the jail until tempers cooled. He dressed it up as protection, but everyone knew what it meant. Once the Apache was locked up, Boone's men would decide his fate. When Dugan rode out to the cabin, he found Chayton splitting wood. "Come with me, son," the sheriff said, voice heavy. "It's the only way I can keep the peace." Chayton set the axe down and faced him. "If I go into that cell for a crime I didn't do, then tomorrow every man in this town is guilty when Boone comes knocking, and none of you will stand up, because you'll already be bowed." The silence stretched long. Dugan's hand hovered near his badge, but he let it fall. He could not meet Chayton's eyes. That night, Nora did what no court could. She found Chayton sitting alone by the porch, the cold cutting deep into his bones. She held out a knitted scarf, rough but warm, the last gift her husband had left behind. "This was his," she said, her voice trembling. "But tonight, it's yours, because under this roof, you are not an outsider." Chayton took it gently, like it was more fragile than glass. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of belonging. Then came the revelation that shifted the ground under all their feet. The old priest of Silver Creek, Father Mallory, had kept his mouth shut through the rumors and the fires. But one evening he pulled Sheriff Dugan aside and placed a battered leather ledger in his hands. "These are the original land surveys," the priest whispered. Boone redrew the markers. He pushed the line north, swallowed up the spring on Mrs. Hart's property. "He's lied to this town for years, and now he's ready to bleed it dry." Dugan leafed through the brittle pages, his face growing darker with each line. The truth lay plain. Boone had stolen water, the one resource more valuable than gold in the desert. The sheriff walked out into the snow, breathing hard. His boots took him to the noose, still swinging in the wind. He stared at his badge, then tore it from his chest and hung it on the rope. "Tonight I stand as a man," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll see if I'm still sheriff." The town now stood at a precipice. Boone had his hired guns, Chayton had his honor, and Nora at his side. Dugan had finally chosen, though it might cost him everything. And so I'll leave the question with you. When the scales of justice tilt, should an old sheriff keep his office to protect a sliver of law, or should he throw his badge into the dust, fight as a common man, and keep his dignity intact? The storm had swallowed the horizon by the time both sides met at the wooden bridge. Snow lashed sideways, filling the air with a white fury, the wind shrieking through the birches like 1,000 voices. Torches flared in the gale, their flames bending and snapping, painting wild shadows across the frozen creek. On one end stood Chayton Naichi, the Apache tracker who had lived too long between two worlds, his dark eyes steady beneath the scarf Nora had given him. Beside him was Nora Hart herself, slim shoulders squared, clutching a revolver that looked too large for her hands but steady all the same. Sheriff Walt Dugan leveled his Winchester, his jaw set like a man who had finally chosen his hill to die on. Behind them clustered a handful of townsfolk, the blacksmith with a hammer at his belt, the widow who had been fed from Chayton's deer, 2 farmers with pitchforks. They were not soldiers, but they were tired of living under Boone's thumb. Across the bridge waited Elias Boone, broad and sneering, his fur coat flapping open as if the storm dared not touch him. Around him stood the 3 hired killers he'd brought in from the border towns. Their faces were cold, unreadable, their pistols gleaming in the torchlight. Boone raised his voice above the wind, each word cutting like a knife. "This is your last night, Naichi. You and the woman step aside, and maybe I let the rest of this rabble crawl home." The wind whipped at Chayton's hair, but his voice carried calm, deep and unyielding. "You've stolen land, burned food, and poisoned your own town with lies. It ends here, Boone, at this bridge." The first gun barked before anyone could breathe. One of Boone's men lunged forward, boots slipping on the ice. His shot went wide, cracking into the frozen creek. Dugan fired in that same instant, his Winchester booming through the storm. The man spun, fell hard, and did not rise again. The second gunman came in fast, revolver raised. Chayton closed the distance in 2 strides, slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, and wrenched the pistol free. The outlaw gasped, stunned, before Chayton's blade kissed the hollow of his throat. In the blink of an eye, his fight was gone. The third raised his Colt, sight fixed on Chayton's back. Nora's cry split the storm as she fired, her first shot in her life. The bullet tore into the bridge's timber just inches from Boone's man. But it was enough. He flinched, his aim ruined, and a farmer behind Chayton cracked him across the skull with a shovel. The outlaw dropped like a sack of grain. For a heartbeat, all was still but the screaming of the wind. Boone's face twisted with rage. His empire of lies was collapsing before him. Then came the voice of Father Mallory, white beard frozen stiff, clutching the cracked leather survey book high above his head. "Here!" the old priest cried. "Here is the truth! The spring belongs to the Hart property! Boone redrew the markers! He stole from every one of you!" Dugan seized the ledger, his voice ringing like iron. "The records prove it! Boone's land grab, his false claims, it's all written here. Boone is the thief, not the Apache." Murmurs swept the gathered crowd, faces turning from doubt to shame, from shame to anger. Boone saw the tide shifting, saw his grip slipping. He snarled, whipped his revolver up, and leveled it at Nora's chest. The world slowed to a heartbeat. Chayton moved first. He threw himself between them, the shot exploding into the night. Fire seared down his arm as the bullet carved a bloody path from shoulder to wrist. He staggered but stood tall, teeth clenched against the pain. Nora's revolver shook in her hands, but she squeezed the trigger again. This time the round buried itself in the timber just beside Boone's hand, the splinters stinging his knuckles. The shock stalled him, and in that instant, Dugan surged forward. With the strength of a man half his age, he wrenched Boone to the planks, slammed the revolver from his grasp, and ground him beneath the barrel of his Winchester. "Enough!" Dugan roared. The torches hissed in the storm, and the townsfolk pressed closer. Some shouted for Boone to hang on the spot. Others called for a trial. But there was no marshal within 100 miles, no circuit judge who could ride through the snow in time. Silver Creek had only itself, its conscience, its courage, its reckoning. Dugan pulled the iron cuffs from his belt and snapped them around Boone's wrists. He rose, Boone struggling beneath him, and lifted his voice to the crowd. "Elias Boone is under arrest. From this night forward, the law here will not be what's easy, but what's right." The storm seemed to still for a moment. The faces in the torchlight turned from fear to something harder: resolve. They saw Boone for what he was: a liar, a thief, a man who had nearly starved them for profit. They spat at his name, and the sound of it was heavier than any jury's gavel. At the edge of town, the noose swayed wildly on its branch. A farmer cut it down. Without a word, they carried it to the church, shoved it into the iron stove, and watched it curl black in the fire. The rope that was meant for an innocent man burned instead as a funeral for lies. Snow thickened, falling so hard it covered blood and boot prints alike. The winter had passed its judgment, not by a federal court, not by soldiers, but by the people who had finally chosen to stand. Silver Creek would remember this night as long as men could speak. The night justice came not by decree, but by the courage of those who would no longer look away. When the storm finally broke, the valley lay in silence, buried beneath a quilt of snow. Silver Creek's streets were muffled, its roofs heavy with white, but the air had changed. The noose was gone, Boone was in irons, and for the first time in years the townsfolk looked at one another without flinching. Chayton Naiche did not ride away. Instead, he stayed by Nora's side through the long winter. He mended the barn that sagged beneath the snow, dug fresh trenches to keep the spring runoff from flooding her floor, and split enough wood to last till April. He did it quietly, without boasting, without asking for coin or reward. When Nora pressed him to take her husband's tools, he shook his head. When the town offered him rations as payment, he declined. "I want only one thing," he said, standing before the church one frosty dawn. "The right to walk into Silver Creek as a man, not as a shadow." There was no vote, no proclamation, just a silence that felt like agreement. And from that day, when Chayton entered the store or passed along the boardwalk, heads nodded instead of turning away. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was respect, and that was enough. Spring eventually came. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and the valley bloomed with new grass. Nora's land was safe, her spring restored, the ledger sealed the claim beyond Boone's reach. Life went on, but the memory of that night on the bridge lingered, etched into every man and woman who had stood beneath the torches. And in those memories lived a truth as sharp as a winter wind. On the border between snow and sand, honor is the only fire that keeps a man's heart warm. For those of us listening now, many years removed from that frontier, the lesson still carries weight. In our own time, surrounded by rumors, lies, and the easy pull of prejudice, justice does not ride in on horseback. It arrives only when ordinary people decide to stand, even if it costs them comfort or reputation. Sometimes it means doing what Dugan did, laying down the badge, the chair, the title, because the truth matters more than the seat you hold. A worthy community isn't built by grand speeches. It's built in small choices, sharing meat with a widow, standing up for a neighbor, or refusing to repeat a lie when it would be simpler to nod along. These acts may seem small, but they stitch together the fabric that holds men and women through their hardest winters. And each of us carries a badge of our own. Even if it's invisible, that badge is honor. It's the coat you wrap around yourself when the storm hits, whether the storm is debt, illness, or loneliness. Without it, you freeze. With it, you endure. Thank you for listening to the story of Chayton Naiche and the Winter of Silver Creek. If it sparked a fire in you, if it reminded you of something still warm beneath your coat, then I ask you, follow Dust and Destiny, share this tale with a friend who might need it, click like, and leave a comment below. Tell me this, in your corner of the world, what does frontier justice look like? And if you carry a story of your own, send it to us by email. Who knows? When the next winter comes, maybe an entire town will stand still in silence, listening to your words.